We will now discuss 20th century sexuality researchers, but first some background. The 19th century model of sexuality and sexual behavior was almost a purely medical one. Individuals who differed from the accepted norms were considered to be ill, or in scientific terms, deviant or pathological. Little was known about sexual attitudes, behaviors, and activities. There was a dearth of knowledge about sexuality from psychological, psychosocial, and physiological perspectives. Sexual attitude and behavioral research lacked respectability, and many institutions would not fund or support it. By the 1930s, a number of things led to a greater acceptance of human sexuality as a legitimate field for research. There had been changes in public attitudes in the United States, for one. Second, there was a desire for contraception for the purposes of child spacing and population control. And lastly, there was a more open interest in the scope of sexual behavior. Perhaps the most important such researcher early in the 20th century, actually mid-20th century, was Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey was a biologist and zoologist. He joined the Indiana University faculty in 1920 and gained recognition early in his career through his writings in biology. He was an entomologist and a very well-renowned entomologist who studied insects. In 1937, he became the teacher of a newly introduced course in marriage and sexuality education. As his interest grew, he began to amass information concerning sexual activities and beliefs about sexuality. His scientific background led him to gather facts and statistical data. By 1939, he had collected 733 sex histories. He realized the need to standardize his data collecting methods, and he developed a detailed list of 521 interview questions. Up until that time, he had obtained the largest amount of human sexuality information ever collected. His interviews covered 6 ways in which males and females achieve orgasm in our culture. These included masturbation, nocturnal sex dreams and emissions, heterosexual petting, heterosexual premarital intercourse, homosexual intercourse, and sexual contact with animals. He also focused on 9 major areas. These included social and economic data, marital history, sexuality education, physical and physiological data, nocturnal sex dreams, masturbation, heterosexual history, homosexual history, and animal contacts. He collected data from only white males and females who represented rural and urban areas in each state, and he also collected information on a range of ages, marital statuses, educational levels, occupations, and religions. His sample contained a disproportionately high number of better educated people living in cities, and all of his subjects were volunteers. His research may be the best known example of survey research related to sexuality, but his sample is not viewed as representative of the United States population. He and his colleagues interviewed around 17,000 Americans about their sex lives. His first book was Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, published in 1948, and it was based on interviews with 5,300 males. His second book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, was published in 1953 and was based on interviews with 5,900 females. He was not the first researcher to do a sex survey by questionnaire or interview, but his method was revolutionary due to a wide variety of sexual activities that he covered and the applied quantitative statistical methods that he used. Americans had little knowledge about sexual behavior in our culture before him, and his conclusions generated much public reaction. He also found marked class differences in sexual behavior and attitudes. For one, he concluded that there was a relationship between sexual behaviors and attitudes on the one hand, and education and socioeconomic factors on the other. In males, he found that lower educational level correlated with higher premarital activity, For women, his findings were just the opposite. A higher educational level in women correlated with a higher premarital activity. He found that women who had premarital orgasms were more likely to experience marital orgasms. He also found that most of the married females he interviewed reported an orgasmic response through coital and non-coital sexual behavior. He also found that only about 2% of women reported a complete lack of sexual arousal. A great many of his subjects reported childhood sexual experiences which reinforced Freud's belief that sexual expression is experienced in childhood. He concluded from his data that people are sexual from early childhood through adulthood. People are unaccustomed to answering questions about the intimate details of their sex lives or about stigmatized behaviors like marital infidelity. To encourage honesty, Kinsey took great pains to ensure the confidentiality of his interviewees' identities and their responses. Such confidentiality is now recognized as an essential ingredient of a valid survey. In fact, surveys are sometimes designed to allow interviewees to give answers to sensitive questions anonymously through mail-in questionnaires or by direct entry into a computer. Since his sample is a disproportionately large number of educated, urban, Protestant young people with fewer, less educated, rural, older persons, it did not represent the population in general. Despite the large number of interviewees in the Kinsey surveys, their answers were not necessarily representative of the U.S. population as a whole, let alone of the entire human race, as implied by the titles of his books. It's possible that the people who volunteered to participate were relatively free-thinking and socially adventurous. He would ask clubs, groups, and associations for interviews, and he interviewed all of the willing members. The great majority of the interviewees were urban whites living in the northeastern United States, and many of them lived in Indiana, where Kinsey was based. Thus, the statistics that were quoted by Kinsey are no longer considered to be reliable. He defended his work by explaining that the nature of sexual behavior made it hard to get answers from large numbers of people, since too many refused. Despite the limitations of his study, his work was hailed as the first large-scale study of sexual behavior. His books had a large effect on subsequent research and society in general by opening up the subject. Despite criticism his work evoked, some of it was justified. It was generally acknowledged at the time for its objectivity and its scholarly approach and scope. He entered into taboo areas in American society, and he influenced an entire generation by increasing our awareness about sexual activities that we were engaged in. He prodded people to rethink their own attitudes about these behaviors. Kinsey's findings on masturbation were very interesting, and I'll list a few of them for you. He found that close to 92% of males in his study stated that they had masturbated at some point in their lives. The highest incidence reported was between the ages of 16 and 20. He found that around 62% of females reported that they had masturbated. He found that the higher educational level of professionals correlated with a greater incidence of masturbation in both males and females. And he found that they masturbated much more often than those who had little education or those who worked as laborers. He also found that in both males and females, stronger religious adherence correlated with a lower incidence of masturbation, which is not really that surprising. In terms of nocturnal dreams about sex, and these are dreams that were about sex that were experienced by both sexes, he found that 70% of women had dreams about sex. About 90% of women who reported having sexual dreams reported having heterosexual dreams about sex partners who they could not identify. About 37% of 45-year-old women had experienced dreams that led to orgasm. The highest incidence of nocturnal emissions were reported by 71% of single males between the ages of 21 and 25 years. With respect to heterosexual petting, which is defined as a deliberate attempt to effect erotic arousal through any physical contact that does not involve intercourse, he also found a number of interesting things. He found that 88% of all males had engaged in petting or would engage in some form of petting before marriage. Over 25% of males had experienced orgasm through petting before marriage. He found that the highest incidence of heterosexual petting in males occurred between the ages of 16 and 20 years, with tremendous variation in frequency. He also found that petting in males occurred primarily among those in high school and college, with 92% of males in this group actively involved before marriage. He found that 40% of females in his study experienced heterosexual petting by the age of 15, and between 69 and 95% had such experience by the age of 18. He found that petting to the point of orgasm during the late teen years was reported by 23% of females. He reported that the average frequencies of petting among single females between the ages of 15 and 25 ranged from once per week to once per month, with an average of about once every 2 weeks for a typical female. In total range, 90% of females had some petting experience before marriage. With respect to premarital intercourse, he found that 22% of all adolescent males had experienced intercourse, and among college males, 67% had experienced it. He found that nearly 50% of females reported premarital intercourse, and about 2/3 of married females reported sexual orgasm before marriage through any one of 5 techniques, including masturbation, nocturnal dreams, heterosexual petting, heterosexual coitus, and homosexual contacts. At all social levels, devoutly religious males and females reported much less premarital intercourse than non-devout subjects. He also found that people who were married earlier had experienced premarital intercourse at a younger age, while those who married later began premarital intercourse at a later age. With respect to homosexual activity, he found that homosexual incidence was at its highest in high school males. He found that about 37% of all males had had at least one sexual contact with another male, resulting in orgasm at some time between adolescence and old age. This challenged the then prevailing view that homosexual relationships are some kind of rare aberration. He also discovered that 25% of females aged 30 years and over had been erotically aroused by other females, and 17% had experienced sexual contact with other females. Female homosexual contact was greatest in college and graduate school groups. The Kinsey Institute is still operating as the Kinsey Institute for Research in Sex, Gender, and Reproduction, and it is still located at Indiana University.